Hi, I'm Siva Vaidhyanathan. I'm a professor at the University of Virginia. I've been writing books and articles about the internet industry, specifically about companies like Facebook and Google, for a number of years. And I've written a number of books as well about copyright and the ways in which copyright operates in the digital environment. Like many of the people in my field, I have, of course, taken a very strong interest in the consequences and developments in artificial intelligence. Now, this isn't a new thing. Those of us who've been paying attention to companies like Facebook and Google for a number of years or even decades have understood that almost since the beginning of those companies, they have been building in technologies to their main systems that are essentially what we're talking about when we talk about artificial intelligence, machine learning systems, the sort of complex neural networks that are actually almost impossible to understand from the outside and seem to do incredible work by milling through large sets of data, finding patterns, creating new patterns, making predictions, and then producing some sort of output. And that output could be, a list of search results. The output could be a series of advertisements carefully targeted to people who are using, let's say, Facebook or YouTube or Instagram, or better than that, TikTok, which has the most advanced AI-driven algorithm you can imagine. So all of these companies have been using this stuff for years, building it in, not really labeling it as AI. It's almost a given in many of these companies that this was just the way to do what they do in the most efficient and effective and powerful way. And it's been an arms race among all these different companies, as well as sort of a larger arms race between, let's say, China and the United States. But that's a whole other story and a whole other presentation. In the last couple of years, of course, we have seen the public release of some really interesting, potentially transformative platforms like Wall-E, like ChatGPT, that allow for the generation of what appears to be somewhat creative material. It's debatable, and we'll get into that aesthetic question soon. And that has, of course, unleashed a series of anxieties and promises and opportunities that have been floating around the public for the last couple of years. It kind of bugs me that it took the release of ChatGPT to get everyone thinking about AI, because, as I said, the stuff has been built into systems for years and has been part of our lives for years. We just weren't told about it explicitly, and the journalists who cover tech hadn't done a very good job of explaining the extent to which we have been dependent on AI for a number of years. But the second thing is that a lot of what we've been hearing are nightmare scenarios about, like, the end of humanity, right? These big science fiction type possibilities that, where the computers become so advanced and they become sentient and they start making decisions for themselves and decisions that aren't in the interest of humanity. And all of a sudden we're all wiped out and we all are basically living in the Matrix, because what I've just described is basically the plot of the Matrix, or the foundational theme of the Matrix. And that's kind of cool to think about, but it's not likely. I would say it's basically almost impossible and not worth our time to worry about it. What we have not been paying attention to are the cultural and intellectual consequences, as well as the actual life or death consequences of already existing AI technologies that have been baked into our lives in almost invisible ways. And, of course, the subject of this conversation, how generative AI, both in its most obvious forms through these, platforms that are labeled so, and in more discrete forms in other systems, might affect the creative industries, the creative communities, specifically, of course, composers. So for that reason, I would like to walk through a lot of the what I consider the potential threats of the growth of generative AI to the creative communities. These are not equal in risk. Some of the risks will be more obviously problematic, obviously dangerous than others. Some of them will be more likely to come true than others. But I wanted to give you a full catalog of the things to worry about. I know, what a kind of a rude thing to do. Hey, here's some stuff to worry about. And at the end, I'm going to give you a very unsatisfying way to respond. So I'll give you a heads up about that. I don't want to scare anybody with this stuff. There is no pending nightmare or meltdown for the creative industries any more than there is for humanity. But there are questions, risks, and possibilities that we must take seriously and we must deliberate on, study, and address before things well up on us and overwhelm us. And we've seen that happen with other similar new technologies in the past few decades, including social media, including search engines, including YouTube. So let's not get caught again. I see composers as one of the more potentially significant groups of creators who can rally and converse with the major stakeholders of their world and industry and be able to maybe articulate a different vision for how AI might affect the creative industry. So that's why I'm really thrilled that I was asked to contribute to this conversation. Okay, let's move on here. So what are we talking about with AI? Well, as I like to say, artificial intelligence is neither artificial nor intelligent. There's nothing artificial about these systems. They are what we technology scholars call socio-technical systems. They do not exist independently of human input, human feedback, and humans don't exist in a technology-free space either. And that's important because look, whenever we're talking about the consequences of technology, we often hear people try to isolate the variables, or we see people isolating the variables and trying to say like, oh, is it society? Is it people, or is it the technology? That is the wrong question, because the answer is always both. The answer is always both because technologies don't matter if people aren't interacting with them. The use and elaboration of technologies by human beings, the exercise of human judgment upon technology, feeds back through the results and acculturation and further use and adaptation and change on what human beings expect of themselves, of their powers, of life, of their mental faculties, physical faculties, and culture and society. So it's about a constant feedback loop and interaction between what we call technologies and what we might call society. But they are not distinct. They are not distinct, right? So in that sense, anything we're talking about with artificial intelligence is not artificial any more than human beings are artificial. They are connected to us. They only matter because they're connected to us. They only matter because we're interacting with them. We're plugging things into the search queries, into the query box, and doing, creating prompts that generate results, generate some sort of output, and then we use that output in our lives, thus touching other humans with it, right? That's the important part of the circuit. But also, it's not really intelligence what's going on in those systems, right? There's no judgment. There's no discrimination. There's no sense of hierarchy or morality or ethics or propriety. There's no weighing of values going on. There's merely mimicry. Mimicry of expressions that seem increasingly human-like. And they do that, like these systems do that, through complex, massive pattern recognition, right? They accumulate data, huge data sets. They train themselves on the data sets. The process of training themselves on the data sets actually changes the computer itself, changes the computer program itself, the algorithm itself. There's adaptation to the the data set. Then there's output, and then there's interactions with humans. But fundamentally, it's about recognizing patterns, how language works, right? This word tends to follow this word in a human sentence in English. So whenever someone has a prompt that has this one word, the next word is probably appropriate in the response. That's prediction. So there's pattern recognition and then prediction that creates the output. And the generation of this output is what we call generation, which is why we call it generative AI. It is not intelligent. It is merely mocking. It is merely copying. It is merely regurgitation, digestion, and then regurgitation, right? That's really what's happening here. So unfortunately, we're stuck with this term, artificial intelligence. It's been around for 50 years. It's a branch of computer science that had, various other sub-branches and remains a really complex and fascinating area of investigation in computer science. But the phrase artificial intelligence somehow made it into science fiction, somehow made it into the public mind, and we're stuck with it, unfortunately. I would rather use terms like machine learning, neural networks, generative systems, for instance, rather than thinking about artificial or intelligence. But again, we're stuck with it. All right, let's talk about some of these risks. The first risk or complexity has to do with copyright issues. There are two sides to this. First of all, we get these big engines because they scrape existing work, copyrighted work, from everything that we have been publishing on the web for the past 25 years. Right? We went and threw everything up on the web, and lo and behold, somebody's harvesting it all. Who could have thought, right? I mean, Google was already doing this, by the way, and we know that that's how Google builds its search engines. That's how Google built its whole books project. That's how Google has been able to generate translation, which is a form of AI, by the way, an application of AI. That Google Translate is an application of AI. That's how Google has been able to meld in information and background and documents to its map system, which, by the way, is another application of AI, as all of this is. And so we've been watching this happen at Google for a long time. And the question is, though, what about all these copyrighted works, right? People spend years creating images, creating sounds, music, creating text. I create text. I write books. Turns out my books are all being chopped up and digested by these big AI companies to help them create this new product that I'm not particularly crazy about. It helps my students cheat, among many other problems. But hey, I can't stop it. I can't stop it. Why? Unfortunately, the copyright case law right now is in favor of the AI companies because one of the major AI companies, Alphabet / Google, won a huge lawsuit a number of years ago about the copyright implications of scanning in all those thousands of books, millions, I'm sorry, why did I say thousands? Millions of books from around the world into Google Books. The publishers and the authors sued Google saying, this is a unauthorized commercial use of our material. And what happened? The courts said, hey, guess what? It's a transformative use. They're not competing with the original in the marketplace. They're in the back room scanning all this stuff. It has to happen for any search engine to work. It's just a big book search engine. It might even enhance availability and access to books. And for that reason, it counts as fair use. It's transformative. It doesn't compete in the marketplace, etc. And so Google prevailed, and these AI companies have been able to do what they do with great confidence that they are shielded by that Google decision, and they're probably right. I do think it's worth asking whether this is the way, appropriate and intended consequence of fair use and appropriate and intended consequence even of the Google Books decision. It certainly follows from the Google Books decision, but we don't, look, the court did not consider what it would mean to create these massive new systems that actually would directly compete with the original work by virtue of recapitulating and regurgitating elements of the original work in a new frame that competes for the attention of the reader, viewer, listener, etc. So I do think that there's something worth digging into that might not yield a complete change in the law, but is definitely worth considering. But that's one side of the copyright issue. You might think of that as the supply side of the copyright issue. But then there's the demand side of the copyright issue, which is how are we going to know and how are we going to protect with copyright the work that is generated either totally or in part by generative AI, right? So what happens if I decide to write a poem and I start by asking ChatGPT a prompt and it generates a bunch of text? There's no human author attached to that, but I then take that and I start building on it or editing it, or maybe I don't do very much at all. And I slap my name on it and I publish it. And I might, it doesn't even matter if I concede that this was at least partially, if not completely, generated by AI. The copyright implications are still up in the air, right? Did a machine do what I'm saying is creative work, or did a machine do it in concert with my human judgment? I approved that this collection of text should be used as a poem. That's my editorial judgment. I generated the prompt that went into the system that created these words. I didn't write the algorithm, though. Somebody else did. And someone at OpenAI did, and some group of people did. So who's the author of this poem? Is there an author of this poem? Is this poem supposed to be protected by copyright? It's a big question. Right now, the U.S. Copyright Office and a number of different copyright regulators around the world are pondering these rather philosophical questions. They are open questions right now. We will see how it proceeds. It's going to be pretty interesting as we see more and more works, at least partially AI generated. And, look, we've already seen this in the visual arts for a long time. There is currently a play at Lincoln Center written by prize winner Ayad Akhtar that is also both about AI and partially written and generated by AI. It's a fascinating play. So we're going to see more and more of this. It's a pretty big question. So I would say, again, there's no direct threat to like a meltdown in the copyright system because of this stuff. It's more of a continuation of what we've seen before. There is no direct collapse of the market for these works quite yet, and probably whatever effect on the market there will be slow, steady, and probably minimal, but you never know. I do think there are good reasons to dig in and pay attention to these issues and figure out a response on behalf of the composers of the United States to these two sides of the copyright issue. All right. What about the aesthetic question, the devaluation of art? What if, and this is entirely, I would say likely, not just probable, that our world is going to be flooded with gunk, like really boring gunk, mostly in text, right? You're already seeing this if you're like poking around on Facebook. You're seeing a lot of posts that are being sent to you that just clearly have long sort of mini essays generated by AI. Why people are doing this, I don't know, but they're doing it. So our lives are already being filled with this like Wonder Bread version of text, just completely overprocessed. Maybe Pringles, like what Pringles is to potato chips. AI generated text is to writing, although that probably doesn't give enough credit to potato chips. What happens when our world is filled with all of these like just banal images and banal sounds and banal songs and banal texts, banal stories, banal accounts, banal, who knows what, right? And, it's all just so dull and uninteresting. And, will the flood of what used to be called content through mass production not just flood markets out and crowd out the good stuff, but just bore us to death So we're no longer interested in poetry because most of the poetry we see is boring, and we're not interested in the graphic arts because the graphic arts are just, just dull. So that's, I think, a consideration. I have no idea how to respond to it. I do think it's something we have to worry about with our critical faculties, and there's a reason why. Because the creative process is being altered. You might argue that it is being supplemented. I would say it is seeing its foundations morph a bit. One of the things I worry about, and I see this in my students, is that when they rely on AI to even write the first draft of something, and you can imagine relying on AI to write the first draft of a score or a song, for instance, that's a crutch. That's a way of making sure your muscles remain weak, right? That's a way to outsource the first step of human judgment. And a lot of people are just going to stick with that, whatever the generative AI system produces. A lot of people are going to build upon it, edit it, change it up a little bit. Both of those things are likely to happen. Nonetheless, what I worry about is we get even more lazy and less skilled, right? Less skilled at writing clearly and with elegance and style, less skilled at drawing or singing with elegance and style, because it just becomes too easy to do the basics. Again, I don't know what to do about that, but here's a bigger thing. These systems are fundamentally conservative, and by that I, of course, do not refer to politics. Conservative in the sense that they reward and pass forward the dominant forms of expression, the dominant tropes, the dominant themes, the dominant conclusions of their training data sets. So again, returning to the world of writing, it's what I understand the best. It's a thing we've seen time and time again here. As we see these systems gobble up thousands of accounts of, let's say, climate change. That's not a good one. Let's say thousands of accounts of family issues, right? Family conflicts or something, right? And the ways people have written about family conflicts. And people continue to query these engines about how to handle family conflicts. And what they start to get are over time, are outputs that increasingly sound the same, are citing the same things, are generating the same basic, I don't know if you want to call it wisdom, conclusions, analyses. And then, we take these things and recycle them and put them out in the world. And that creates more training data for these engines. And it doubles down, triples down, quadruples down on these same old tropes. You can imagine the same thing happening in music, right? A 1-4-5 chord change is dominant. Chord progression is dominant in a lot of music. It's so common. If you continue to query a generative AI system for some sort of chord progressions, it's going to increasingly generate predictable, standard, common expressions, right? And it'll just narrow and narrow and narrow as it doubles down, triples down, quadruples down on the same old systems, rewarding what has already been rewarded. That's what I mean by conservative. Limiting the breadth of expression, limiting, in fact, excluding any sense of imagination. I fear we are in danger of devaluing imagination. Now, the opposite could happen, right? We could have this world filled with the boring and banal, and we might find a premium attached to imagination. I mean, that's the best case scenario. And I actually, that would be really cool, right? Where, those who actually put effort into imagination and style and verve maybe get more obviously rewarded on the market. We'll see. We'll see how this all breaks out. But I do worry about the overall homogenization and narrowing of scope. And of course, narrowing of scope and homogenization means things are going to have less sort of, emotional register in them. And I worry about that as well, right? Would a creative system that were dependent on such a conservative set of systems ever allowed for, let alone created punk rock, allowed for, let alone created hip hop, allowed for, let alone created, something like what John Adams composes for his opera works, right? That sense that emotional punch is almost impossible to imagine coming. So again, I could be fearing the collapse and marginalization of the emotional elements in composition, but it could go the exact opposite way. So, but it's worth paying attention to and articulating. And then of course there are the economic challenges, the money. What about the money? Look, we're going to see some job displacement in some areas as AI gets built into certain things. Ironically, I think the careers most directly and immediately threatened by generative AI are in the computer world, where these systems are really good at producing computer code. That it's their nature. It's what they know. It's what they do. Computer code does not necessarily demand imagination or reward imagination. Conservative, regurgitation of things that actually work is really valuable in computer science, as opposed to not so valuable in poetry and music and so forth, right? So I actually think while journalists all fear for their jobs, I think it's much more likely that other things will kill journalism before AI does, number one. But number two, that it actually is the coders of the world who are in most immediate danger. And a lot of them are already being replaced in companies like Facebook, where basic generative AI structures do the core work that a lot of entry-level coders used to do. But look, as we examine the economic changes, it's not just about job displacement. It's also about the ways in which certain forms of expression that might be perhaps less dense or less elaborate, like, as I said in the slide, jingles, background music, etc., television scoring, advertisement scoring, those things which almost demand a conservative approach, a familiarity, might end up being better supplied by AI-generated material or AI-enhanced material. And I think there's real reason for people who work in those industries and make decent money from it, even while they're at home working on their opera, that they might end up losing out on some important revenue. I think we have to be aware of the very distinct possibility of some displacement, some friction in those labor markets, right? That said, we have seen screenwriters in their strike from last year take seriously these challenges. And they worked with and against some stakeholders, including the AI companies and the studios, and the big companies, the big release platforms like Netflix, to put some limits on the ways in which generative AI might be used to supplant the labor of writers. It was a pretty bold and concerted move. It was a reason to be hopeful about the fact that people in the creative industries can actually learn about this stuff and fight back and put pressure on the other players in the industry with authority and some power. And so, I hope that we all learn from that. But a lot of what they were talking about is how people are going to get paid. So, and then of course there's the possibility that the price of everything starts dropping closer to zero because there's just going to be more junk out there, and we do have to worry about that. So, all right, what about the ethical considerations? Again, this is something that I don't think we talk about enough in the public. I do know that in the industries, in the AI industry and in the creative industries, there's a lot of attention being paid right now to what we call watermarking technologies that can put sort of some sort of disclosure on work saying artificial intelligence had nothing to do with the creation of this work. Artificial intelligence was used in the following ways in the creation of this work, or this work was entirely generated by artificial intelligence. Some sort of labeling, some sort of transparency with metadata, so the computers can read it, it can affect search and so forth. Those sorts of efforts are actually quite interesting and somewhat exciting. If we can get all the players in the industry to agree on a set of standards for labeling things and making sure we know that they were created by humans when they're created by humans, or by computers when they're created by computers, or some hybrid, which is going to be most work going forward. And it's kind of like having the labels on food. That could be really helpful, but do beware, because even if all the players here in North America agree to certain standards and practices, it doesn't include people who are using all of this open source artificial intelligence code to create systems in places beyond our reach, beyond the negotiation. Places like the Philippines, Indonesia, Ukraine and Russia, Nigeria, places that have a lot of coders and a lot of people who are looking to get into this world, but don't have to conform to the standards that American companies will have set for themselves in collaboration. So that's something to be worried about and worry about. We also have to worry in general when we're dealing with AI about the biases and limitations of the training data itself. We might see a drop off in the diversity of expression. I've talked about this already just a few minutes ago. This is a different way of looking at it. The reason that we think about biases and AI is that so much AI right now is being used in systems that directly affect human beings and their bodies, like establishing prison sentences. For instance, there are AI systems that predict recidivism, and courts are using those right now to figure out how long someone should be in prison based on a set of factors that reflect historical data and thus reflect historical biases. Predictive policing, which is a big thing in almost every major city, has some predictive policing element helping guide their deployment of patrols. We've known for decades that some American neighborhoods are over-policed and some are under-policed. We assume sometimes that they are over-policed because there is some historical record of arrests or violence. But those are often a result of the assumption that those should be the neighborhoods that police are paying attention to. We have decades, centuries of human bias built into the training data that guides these predictive policing systems. So that concern really comes from those sorts of things. Look, AI is being used right now, to police people's neighborhoods, to determine how long they're in prison, but also, some life and death stuff, like how missiles are being targeted in certain parts of the world right now. There's a lot going on we should be paying attention to. So how does that all get back to the world of the creative industries, specifically composing? Well, only obliquely, but I do think we have to worry about, again, the narrowing of tropes, of the set of tropes that are considered legit or marketable, and the ways in which marginal communities might be locked out of that. We might not find the next great Francophone West African artist because the algorithms, the AI systems were biased against that particular rhythm pattern, that particular set of musical expressions, that particular collection of instruments. The computers couldn't recognize it as something worthy of passing on and amplifying. And that can reinforce biases that we already have in the world. The risk is much higher in the area of law enforcement, certainly, but it is not without risk in the creative world. We do not want to live in a world with fewer options, less interesting music. And I do think that that's a real possibility going forward. All right, what are we going to do about all this? I'm gonna tap back to the writers, the Screenwriters Guild. The people, the leaders of that organization rallied their membership, gave them stuff to read, gave them a vocabulary and a reason to protest, a reason to strike ultimately, and made some deal points, things that they needed to see in the contract before they signed a contract with the studios. And it worked for the most part. I don't think they solved all their problems, and certainly not for all time, but it put these issues on the table, which makes them the subject of constant examination, deliberation, and negotiation. That's about all we can hope for right now. I don't think we should get our hopes up for some sort of regulatory congressional intervention, not just because Congress is a mess, right? And American politics are a mess. We know that. It's more because we should not expect whatever Congress does to pay attention to the creative industries with much commitment. Congress is not going to care whether our musical tastes are fully represented through these systems. Congress is going to care about people's jobs. Congress is going to care about, the areas that might affect the industries that have big lobbyists, but that's not the composers necessarily, as you know. So this is really going to be a matter of negotiation, education, promotion, engagement, deliberation, and the hard work. We're really going to have to do the hard work here. And all the, myself as a writer, you as composers, you're going to have to do the hard work to educate yourself on how AI is likely to affect your world and our cultural world, because that ultimately is what I'm worried about, that our cultural world could grow a lot less interesting over the next couple decades. I really don't think we should let that happen. All right. Thanks again for your time. You can see my email down here if you want to pop a line to me and tell me what you thought of this presentation, or ask questions, or, give me some helpful criticism. Thank you again. Bye.